Thank you for coming. My name is Gary Wan. I am one of the directors of Tsung Tsin Association in Hawaii. I'm also the outreach chair, which we go out and look for different events. Right now, I want to introduce you to somebody who, Dr. Annelise Heinz, who is an expert on Mahjong and the history of Mahjong. She actually wrote her dissertation on the field, and she actually wrote a book on that and some other accolades. So right now, let's see, she is a associate professor at the University of Oregon right now. She is the author of the book Mahjong, a Chinese Game and Making of Modern American Culture. So with that, Annelise, Dr. Heinz, why don't you take over?
Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for this invitation, and thanks to all of you for being here. I have images that go along with my talk, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. And hopefully that all looks good for everybody. Okay, great. So as we just talked about, I am really looking forward to the Q&A and conversations at the end of the talk. And I invite you to share your memories, your experiences with Mahjong. One of the great joys for me with this project has been to hear people's personal memories and stories. And we'll get to hear a few of those also in the talk. And I could not have written this book without people being so generous as to share their experiences with me. So there is a big question embedded in the title of my book, and this is the image you're seeing now is the cover of my book, and that is, how did a Chinese game shape the making of modern American culture? And before I get into that story, I always like to make sure we're all on the same page. I know most folks in the audience are probably at least somewhat familiar with Mahjong, but I don't want to assume any knowledge. So if you don't know anything about Mahjong, no problem. You're very welcome. And just as a quick orientation, Mahjong is a game of skill, originally from China, played by 4 people with domino-like engraved tiles, which you can see here. And these tiles are from the 1920s, so they would have been made out of bone spliced together with bamboo. And the tiles make suits, which you can see here. And the traditional Chinese game is often compared to the card game Gin Rummy. And it is a similar style of play with a lot more complexity in the scoring and strategy around points. Now, rather unusually, something we'll come back to later, is this game has always been able to be played as a gambling game for very high stakes or as more of a parlor game for very, very low stakes. And that ability to span the spectrum of gambling has really shaped its history, its social history and adaptability to different kinds of social milieu and spaces. And that's quite unusual for a game to be able to to span that gambling spectrum. So the question I'm asked most often about this project is how I came to this topic. And the answer is rooted in the year I lived in southwestern China in Yunnan province for the year before beginning my graduate work at Stanford. And this is a photograph I took of the first game I ever played when a friend taught me a very basic, simplified version of the traditional Chinese game that her grandfather had taught her. And as anyone who has gotten into Mahjong can relate to, the sensory aspects really captured me right away. The sound of the tiles, right? The click and also the rumble as you wash or shuffle the tiles in between rounds. The way the tiles feel in your hand, they're cool and smooth and heavy. The designs are beautiful, and each set tells its own story. And as I traveled through China, I saw Mahjong everywhere, and I saw how it brought people together. This is a photograph I took of 4 shop workers on break playing just in the street right outside the shop. And this is 3 women and a man. He's the one sensibly wearing a sun hat. And It's worth pointing out that in the US, Mahjong has become known in its American versions, not in its various Asian styles of play, but in what's called American Mahjong that we'll talk about later. That is primarily a women's game, but in China, Mahjong is and has long been both a men's and women's game, and men and women play it separately or together. Young and old also similarly play it separately and together. Um, and while I was living in China, my aunt visited me and she wanted to know why her Jewish friends in Denver, Colorado played what was clearly a Chinese game. And that is not an obvious connection. Some of you in the audience may not, in fact, know that Mahjong becomes a really important part of Jewish American women's culture. And this was a fascinating question. I thought we could just look it up on the internet. And what I found was that a lot of people had asked that question. There were a lot of theories, a lot of frequently repeated misinformation, but no one had done the historical scholarly research to find that story. And when I just scratched the surface, looking for that initial question about cultural transfer and ethnicity in the United States, I discovered this huge untold story of a international Mahjong craze in the 1920s. And that really pulled me into a much bigger story and project that eventually resulted in my book. So it's really taken me on a kind of research adventure. There is no archive for Mahjong. And especially when I started this project, it was really not on librarians or archivists' radar. Fortunately, I'm happy to say that because of my research, that has actually changed a little bit. There are now more collections and there's more of a historical trail. But it was like a needle in the haystack, and it was really like an adventure. But this is just a snapshot, a kind of collage of the types of sources that I used in my research. Newspapers in English and Chinese, photographs, art inspired by Mahjong, and oral histories. This snapshot here is a photograph of one of the dozens of people who were generous enough to speak with me. And this specific person is Hilda Schaefer, and we will come back to her later in the talk. So let's begin with a brief introduction to the origins of the game. Mahjong evolved as one of many mostly male gambling games in the area around Shanghai in the mid to late 1800s. And it became a part of the cosmopolitan nightlife scene, which you can see here in this 1890s print of a courtesan hall. And courtesan halls were a really important part of the social fabric of this very cosmopolitan city of Shanghai, the turn of the 20th century. And it became increasingly popular among the growing number of American businessmen and expatriates who lived in Shanghai and Beijing after World War I. And multiple people are responsible for bringing Mahjong to the United States, but it's actually not a story in its origins of immigrant transfer. It wasn't that Chinese immigrants were bringing Mahjong with them and introducing it to the United States at that point in time. In fact, most Chinese immigrants in this period at the turn of the 20th century did not know Mahjong. Again, it was really just one of many games. It didn't have any particular significance, and it was popular in areas that were not the places where most immigrants from China or sojourners from China to the United States and back and forth. It was not the areas where they were coming from, where their homes were. Instead, it was really intentionally marketed as a game, as a consumer good to the United States by, again, multiple people who we'll talk about, but most importantly and influentially, a man named Joseph Park Babcock, who was actually a Standard Oil representative stationed in China. And he saw Mahjong as a potentially popular game, that he is entrepreneurial, he could have a side business, spreading it in first among American expatriates and then increasingly non-American expatriates in Shanghai, and then launching it to as this new and exciting game and consumer good that could compete with the popular card game of bridge in the early 1920s. Well, that was successful beyond his wildest dreams. It took off like wildfire. This is an advertisement from the early 1920s, produced by a department store in Sacramento. And you can see how the advertisement really emphasized this sense of exoticism, and the drawings in the background. You can see the lanterns and the brocade lamp with the dragon embroidered on it. White women, some of whom are dressed in Chinese costume or Chinese style hairdos, very opulent, fashionable, and again, this kind of this real sense of exoticism. And they named it Mahjong, which you can see at the top, with the double G to emphasize its difference, right? The double G doesn't do anything in terms of how it's pronounced. It's just to exaggerate a sense that this is not an English word. And you can see, and also in this advertisement, in the bottom left corner, that wooden kind of case with the drawers that pull out. That's what Mahjong sets were sold in and what they looked like in the 1920s. So soon the most elite Americans, from President and First Lady Harding to Hollywood celebrities, right, this new Hollywood industry, starlets, they were all playing it. Newspapers were covering it. And just 2 years after its introduction, Americans made Mahjong sets Shanghai's 6th largest export to the United States, right? I mean, when we're comparing that to, huge imports like rice, right? Mahjong is on there, number 6. And Congress even added a tax law specifically targeting Mahjong imports in 1924, a year when they cut actually most taxes. They added one for Mahjong. So you get a sense of the kind of economic, the size of this economic boom around an incredibly intense fad. And so it's also significant that the American market soon raised the game's profile around the world. So this really becomes a global Mahjong craze. It changes the game's meaning in China too, right? Like thousands upon thousands of these sets are being sold around the world. People start talking about it as, quote, the national game of China. So it's spreading really rapidly in China as well. And again, with this increased stature and meaning, so that it really comes to stand in for a sense of a Chinese cultural export. And that's all happening in the 1920s. And it's notable in part because it's also reflective of the changing cultural influence that the United States is building in the 20th century, where previously, right, there were many Chinese goods and exports that were seen as very markers of refinement for hundreds of years, especially like porcelain or China. And that was true in the United States. It was true even in colonial America. But that was all mimicking these influential tastemakers in London and Europe, right? England especially, but also Europe more generally. And this is really the first time that there is this global fad, particularly attached to this marker of refinement from a Chinese export that is started by American consumers. And we see that kind of cultural influence continue to grow over the 20th century, but this is a really significant turning point. So as this voracious American and quickly international market developed what was really an unimagined appetite for buying these sets, buying Mahjong sets, in 1923, Chinese and Western merchants launched new kinds of large-scale factories in Shanghai that combined a handcrafted manufacturing process, this artisanal work, with streamlined, large-scale, consistent production. Um, and these were tiles sliced, made out of cow bone, carved cow bone, spliced together with bamboo. And so if you look at the caption, you can see here, right? First process in making mahjong, cutting shin bones from USA. So again, this was such a huge boom, making thousands upon thousands of sets, that Chinese manufacturers of the tiles ran out of the domestic supply of cow bones that were used to make the tiles. And this is particularly true because there was really just like a relatively small segment, specifically of cow shin bones, that were appropriate to carve and slice together for the consistent faces on the tiles. And so steamships exporting bones from Chicago stockyards out of Texas would have crossed paths with those then exporting the finished products of mahjong from Shanghai back to the United States. And you get this sense again of this global trade, including raw ingredients and finished products. And during this period, the global price of bone skyrocketed more than 2,000%. So again, like really trying to get the sense of the scale of this consumer fad. So the popularity of mahjong was really across many diverse groups in the United States, and again globally, although I'm focused on what was happening in the US. And so when I say that, I mean across region, across ethnicity, across class, right? Lots of different kinds of people are playing and talking about this game. But what newspapers emphasized over and over again was this image of an urban game played by white socialites in Chinese costume, or really what they imagined to be Chinese costume, often inspired by Chinese opera costumes. So they were women like this society matron in Los Angeles, or this Vanderbilt daughter in Manhattan. She's actually representing a flower tile in a mahjong themed ballet in Manhattan. Or middle-class housewives who read this article in Atlanta, Georgia, explaining how to host a Chinese themed luncheon, which was, quote, all the rage. And you can see, right, in all of these images, and in many, many more that I talk about in the book, but are too many to show you here. You see white women in ornate Chinese-inspired costumes, really experimenting with this sense of exoticism and changing boundaries of respectable femininity and sexuality, boundaries that were shifting across really the globe in this 1920s era, right? This is the jazz age. This is the age of the flappers. Well, with mahjong, matrons, middle-class women, women of wealth, women who are not flappers, could also tap into this sense of boundary crossing femininity, in part because of the ways that ideas about Chinese people and ideas of race and exoticism really took shape in American culture as connected to mahjong. So there's throughout, right, I'm always asking the question of why something happens in historically, right? Why was there this huge boom in the Chinese game in the United States in the 1920s? And also, how did that happen, right? So throughout, you'll hear me toggling back and forth, thinking about the deeper why, which may not be things that people were thinking about consciously or talking about consciously at the time. No one was saying, right, I'm here to experiment with new boundaries of respectable femininity. But that's what I am seeing when something becomes a cultural phenomenon. But I'm also looking at how, right? There were structures involved and individuals involved that also made this happen. And so coming back to the how, right? The mahjong craze hit at the same time in American culture that there was a full takeoff of mass marketing techniques, really new kinds of mass marketing and consumerism, including advertising, catalogs, store displays, and Mahjong was in all of it. It was really connected to all of these new forms of creation of mass consumerism. And so things like having store displays in department stores that would create experiences for the consumer, that was new at this time. And you can see here what a department store in Los Angeles that created a Mahjong display that was meant to be a kind of immersive experience for a presumably white consumer. And here you can see what I talk about as consumer orientalism, which is connecting widespread ideas, particularly in Europe and the US, that was kind of a mishmash of, quote, the East. So that included China, Japan, as well as the Middle East, South Asia, right? Taking goods and ideas about those cultures and just kind of swirling them all together as something called the Orient. And this was very widespread, again, particularly in the broader Anglo world and in Europe at this time. And you can see here the store tapping into that sensory aspect, as well as then here we have this sales lady, a white woman dressed in Chinese costume, hair and buns, and she's selling Mahjong sets in the glass case. Also a new invention, the store glass display case, a new thing at this time, which is advertising multiple kinds of Mahjong sets at different price points in front of her. So from its introduction into American society, newspapers, advertisers, and popular media consistently discussed Mahjong as an embodiment of quote unquote authentic Chinese culture. But a lot of that representation was based in stereotypical understandings because most Americans really did not know much about China. So again, these costumes are inspired by images from opera. That's kind of as good as it gets, right? There's also a lot of negative stereotypes that were widespread. And one of those is particularly important in that Americans have a long history of seeing the defining feature of Chinese people as being inherently different from Westerners. And so until 1952, as many people in the audience may already know and perhaps have had personal experiences with, Chinese and Japanese Americans could not naturalize into citizenship, regardless of how long they had lived in the United States, because of this idea of unassimilability, that they would remain perpetual foreigners. So part of what I talk about in the book is addressing also an irony, a kind of historical irony, where Mahjong exploded into American consciousness at a moment that was also very racist and nativist and anti-immigrant. It was the era of the mainstream popularity of the Ku Klux Klan, which you can see here marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in 1925. And anti-Asian racism pervaded the game's introduction into the United States through things like racist humor, songs about Mahjong that were also literally about attacking Chinese people, lots of derogatory images, again, also often connected to the what was considered humorous or funny, right? Racist humor. But all of that was happening as it became wildly popular explicitly as a Chinese game, because it was a Chinese game, right? That was so, remember that advertisement, remember that sales girl, right? This is directly connected to its popularity. So how do we understand that irony? Well, a key part of that has to do with the contradictions between the symbolism that China and Chinese culture has held in American culture. So alongside negative stereotypes of unsophisticated labor or low quality food or tradition-bound backwardness, right? Those are all well-established negative stereotypes. White Americans also held ancient China in very high esteem. as an earlier paragon of civilization, right? So it was a common to see terms like, oh, well, China was um, uh, elite and sophisticated when Europe was all in huts, right? So this comparison of um, ancient China as a paragon of civilization. And this marketers of Mahjong tapped into this idea and explicitly created a myth of Mahjong being hundreds of years old, an ancient game connected often even to Confucius, right? Confucius was probably the only name of a Chinese person that many Americans would have recognized at the time. Confucius had nothing to do with Mahjong. Okay, remember that Mahjong was developed quite recently in a very modern cosmopolitan context of Shanghai in the mid to late 1800s. Right, this was a very modern context, but you see over and over again images like this one that emphasize this idea of courtly mandarins, often also showing physical markers of Fu Manchu, who was a well-known figure at the time, with the mustache and long fingernails. And again, emphasizing that it was also a game of the royal court, so the super elite of ancient China. And these competitors, so I mentioned, right, Babcock was never the only one trying to sell Mahjong sets. He had all these competitors, especially as the game became more and more popular. And some of the competitors were making Mahjong tiles out of plastic in the United States. And they were advertising their game as supposedly more authentic than Chinese made sets because they had recovered the ancient game and they wasn't what modern day Chinese people were playing, right? That was a messed up version. They've got the most authentic version. So you really see this very, very explicitly. And you also see Chinese Americans and English speakers in China literally writing in newspapers, in trans-Pacific journals, back and forth, saying, this is wrong, right? Do not, how dare you say that this is not a truly Chinese game and that we as modern Chinese people don't get to claim it. So they really pushed back in effective ways against it, against those stereotypical ways to rob Chinese and Chinese Americans of a sense of cultural authority. And in fact, in 1924, a USC Chinese American student was photographed and quoted in the LA Times at a time when most Chinese Americans were rarely referred to as individuals in these mainstream white-owned newspapers, arguing against the advertisement that saying that at that point Babcock had claimed that he owned the game because he made the whole thing up. And she said, no, this is a Chinese game. But she herself is also then reiterating, and it's 2,000 years old, and it's right. It's an ancient part of Chinese culture because she's steeped in those same myth making around the game, but she's using it to claim a sense of cultural authority. So it's really interesting and complicated kind of battles over who gets to claim Mahjong and to what ends. But it really worked. The marketing ploy works, and in a larger consumer population of white Americans, many of them embraced a Chinese game while still rejecting contemporary Chinese people. But it was never only a game played by white Americans. I want to be clear about that. And Chinese Americans leveraged the Mahjong's popularity for economic opportunities in the context of a highly discriminatory economy. So you can see here, there are these two Chinese American men teaching for white women in LA how to play Mahjong. And they were able to charge higher rates as Mahjong instructors because they were supposedly, quote unquote, authentic Chinese Mahjong instructors, even though they almost certainly had just learned the game from the same instruction manuals that were being sold in the department stores. And that was really, again, this moment of opportunity, because they, even if they had gotten, as many did, college degrees from universities that accepted Chinese American students, colleges and universities like Berkeley, getting degrees in English and economics. They could not get hired in the 1920s outside of what were the same kind of economically depressed, dead end jobs that their parents had been able to get. Jobs in curio shops, in restaurant. Not that those jobs aren't important and meaningful, right? But they weren't reflective of upward mobility and the higher education that the second generation had often achieved. So here is this moment where they are actually able to really make significant income selling their abilities as quote unquote authentic instructors at higher rates. So over the following decade, Mahjong became embedded in a built landscape of Chinatown spaces that really served dual purposes, both facing outward to white consumers and facing inward to Chinese Americans. And in the process, the game became established in this tension between inclusion and exclusion that really defined many of the contours of the experience of Chinese American ethnicity in the early 20th century. And in the book, I talk more about how Mahjong becomes part of what I call community homemaking in Chinatown, in Chinatowns all over the country, and as these nodes, right, of regional nodes where people who didn't live in those specific locales would come, and they would come to places like general stores. And these were places to send remittances, collect mail. It was really a crisscross of different streams of Chinese American society at the time. And Mahjong, you can't see Mahjong in this photo, but a set is almost certainly under the counter. This is a picture from a 1942 general store in Manhattan's Chinatown. Or there would have been a game going on in that back room that you can just get a peek into. Very, very often in general stores, there would be games going, particularly among older men, in the backs of the stores. And Mahjong, again, kind of becomes this this community rhythm and sound, that clatter of the tiles, right, that spills through windows, that helps mark space. So the broader fad really dies out by the end of the 1920s, and even by the middle of the decade, the fad slows down. The intensity of the craze slows down. But Mahjong remains a very important part of Chinese American communities. It has some ups and downs in Japanese American communities, both as connected to the broader American craze, but also Japan as in the 1920s, a semi-imperial force in Shanghai, along with these European presence in a semi-colonial port city that Shanghai was. Japan connects with this 1920s Mahjong craze. And so Mahjong becomes a part of Japanese American culture through these various routes, but it is often connected to gambling, and it doesn't really take hold in a lot of social spaces until wartime internment or incarceration of Japanese Americans, when Mahjong becomes something that people can do to make communities in these incarceration camps. And Mahjong kind of crops up again in more significant ways, and in sometimes very conflicted ways during World War II incarceration. So I talk more about that in the book. I'm happy to talk about any more of this also in the Q&A. But after the broader fad dies out, right, Mahjong continues to be played in pockets, certainly connected to Chinese Americans, Chinese American communities around the nation and really around the world, but also other players, including a group of mostly Jewish women in the New York area that were still playing Mahjong and wanted to bring Mahjong back into popularity like it was in the 1920s. So in the late 1930s, the National Mahjong League is formed in Manhattan by a group of Jewish women to revitalize what they believe had been a wrongfully neglected game. And their vision was really to bring it back into that extreme level of popularity as it had been 15 years previous. But what happens is that it really spreads and takes hold among Jewish women, and particularly in the years after World War II. And so we see now kind of, again, the development of a specific form of the game that becomes known as quote unquote American Mahjong. It's worth pointing out that there are actually multiple uniquely American versions of the game, and that is happening in a global context where today there are more than 40 variations of Mahjong around the world. And again, multiple specifically American variations. The League's version is by far the most wide known and most influential of those uniquely American forms. And so this gets back to that question that my aunt asked me that helped spark the project also, of how Mahjong became a defining marker of Jewish American women's culture, particularly in the 1950s and 60s. And so this is a picture of the board of the League shortly after its founding. And one woman, Dorothy Meyerson, was particularly influential in developing and spreading the game. She was very media savvy. Here she is actually teaching people how to play the game through a television program in the early 1950s. And one of the ways that they changed the game is by rather than having a game somewhat similar to gin rummy in the way that winning combinations are formed, there is a smaller number of acceptable winning hands, but more possible combinations of tiles within those hands. And the acceptable winning hands, change every year. So this picture is from the early 1960s, and it's after decades of experimentation and change by the League in concert with the hundreds of players who would write in and come to these annual conferences and conventions and make their suggestions. And one of the key elements of the League's game becomes then this annual card. So the set you're seeing here is a kind of iconically American Mahjong set from the 1960s. And you can see how different it is from those 1920s sets. No longer is it a wooden case with drawers made in China out of bone and bamboo tiles. These were sets made in New York out of plastic. Players used racks, which you could see here. That also has its roots in the 1920s, but it is really an American thing. American players use racks. The tiles are a little bit thinner than most Chinese tiles, so they don't stand up on their own as well. And they use this card, the National Mahjong League's official standard hands and rules. And that card contains the annual winning hands. And if you see anyone playing Mahjong around the world with a card, they're playing the League's version. They're unique among those 40 variations in this form. And so one of the things that also happens is that selling this card becomes a philanthropic tool. So all of these women were wealthy. They not only didn't have to work to support themselves and their families, it was at a time where if they had worked for wages, they would have lost social status. And so they were volunteering their time, but they were very entrepreneurial, which is why they were interested in working on this game. And they were selling this card. Once they covered their basic costs, they had extra income, and they used it to advertise their value as a form of leisure that was still considered kind of productive or moral in an American frame that really often looks down at particularly women's leisure. And so you can see here during World War II, they really advertised this idea of patriotic fundraising, a time when everyone was under enormous pressure to be spending all of their time helping the war effort. They're like, you can help the war effort by playing Mahjong because you will donate your our funds to these various patriotic causes. Now, one other wartime expansion, which I won't talk more about today, but again, talk about in the book, happy to talk more about in the Q&A, is that is also specifically American, took place within military culture. And this is a photograph from the early 1960s of Air Force officers' wives who were teaching a form of the game called Wright Pat or Wright Patterson Mahjong, which was named after the Air Force Base in Ohio where it started. And they started developing their own version of the game during World War II. And this is specifically Air Force officers' wives. And you can see they also have specific winning hands. They have more of them than the League's version does. They don't change them as often, but they do have specific winning hands, and those hands have names, often with military themes, which you can see here, like Pearl Harbor and Independence. And it's in Wright Pat Mahjong that you see the latest kind of echoes of that 1920s culture of white women dressing up in Chinese-inspired costume. You can see that here with these two instructors. This is really the latest example that I've been able to find of that happening. The League doesn't do that, and the Air Force officers' wives don't do that after this period in the 60s. I think because of cultural changes, including the Asian American movement, that pushes back against these forms of cultural mimicry or appropriation. So Dorothy Meyerson was actually connected to this form, this American form of Mahjong as well, because she sold those New York-made sets to the players of Wright Pat Mahjong. And even today, if you go to an Air Force base around the world, you will be able to find Wright Pat Mahjong played by officers' spouses in particular. And now that women are also becoming officers, you sometimes have women who are officers playing as well. But that, again, can become this way to meet people and make community, even as you're getting uprooted, you're in these new places, but that form of Mahjong stays the same in those same contexts. And so you can make community. So by the 1960s, the League's repeated changes had transformed the game enough that it required additional tiles. They added a form of tiles called jokers and different rules. And as we talked about, right, they're using these sets made in the United States. And so you can see this cultural and physical Americanization of the game itself. But even so, right, even with all these changes, they're still using these same Chinese originated designs. These are not Chinese mimicked designs. These are the same die originally that were designed in China of tiles that echo directly those from the 1920s. And that recognizable set of designs that become increasingly standardized during this period really kept it a recognizable form of a shared game, even as so many aspects of the game changed. So those are answering some of those questions about how Mahjong becomes an important part of Jewish American women's culture. It wouldn't have happened without the League. But why, right? Just because the League existed doesn't mean that the game would actually spread or take off or develop any cultural meaning. Well, the answer is connected to a larger story of post-war Jewish middle-class culture. And part of that story has to do with specific forms of leisure and leisure communities that Jewish Americans are expanding and creating in new ways after the war. And one particularly influential area are the Catskill Mountains outside of New York, where women would go with children, stay in these bungalow colonies during the summer to escape the sweltering heat of the cities. Husbands would go back and forth on weekends, and women would create these communities that they really ran, and they could access leisure even while still keeping things basically running because the domestic expectations were lowered in these contexts. Children were at day camp, husbands were away most of the week, and uh, wives, although they still provided, generally speaking, meals and housekeeping, those expectations lessened. And Mahjong became part of the rhythm of these summer communities. And it helped naturalize, I argue, aspects of women's leisure that then became kind of a wedge when bringing the patterns of Mahjong into the home outside of the summer. Right? During the summer, these women could access leisure without making any demands on their husbands and children. Their needs were still being met, and moving them into what was a very unusual rhythm in middle class 1950s households when women were expected to be at home in the evenings, taking care of their families. Mahjong nights, which were hosted by predominantly mothers of young children in these increasingly suburban landscapes, were times that once a week women would gather together when they would cook food that was not there for their families. They couldn't eat it. Their husbands had to put the kids to bed. And it was really just accepted, as this was, in one husband's words, quote, maid's night off, right? The maid being the mom. And this was something that I think many women would have enjoyed and benefited from, but it became a cultural norm in these specific communities because of the larger cultural and geographic patterns that they were helping create. And this has remarkable consistency. Here's an image from Valdosta, Georgia. The image we were just looking at was from Philadelphia. And here we return to Hilda Schaefer's dinette. She took this image, photograph of a game in her Bronx apartment in New York. And you can see the racks, the tiles, the card, right? You can see all those elements, as well as cigarettes. Women often smoked more than they usually did. Sometimes drank more than they usually did because they were just having fun together. They weren't doing anything productive. This wasn't a PTA meeting. This was really just leisure. And very similar snacks connect all of these different, again, regions in this expanding sense of what it meant to be a Jewish American in the years after World War II. And so this is an image from a contemporary artist who focuses on creating images of Jewish culture that he says, quote, ties us all together, even amongst all of this diversity among American Jews. And it's notable, right, that Mahjong is one of those that he chose. So the game's adaptability created barriers as well as bridges, in the sense that among these 40 variations, right, people can't just necessarily sit down and play the same game automatically, even if they're all playing a form of Mahjong. But each of those variations really expresses a unique history of adaptation, and each shapes a specific culture of interaction and play, even while being connected largely through this sensory aspect of the tiles. So Mahjong's American history is rooted in this tension between inclusion and exclusion, as well as the risks of cultural erasure through appropriation or assimilation. And so I argue that Mahjong reveals a deeply American experience, sometimes desired and sometimes enforced, of simultaneously belonging and standing apart. So that's my contact information. Please feel free to be in touch. My website's there with links to other articles and things that I've written. So I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Wow, wonderful.
Thank you.
You want to go off screen share? You know, what I thought was so interesting was the fact that we're talking about this thing that's happening in America during the 1920s, which is the Roaring 20s, right? Which is right after the pandemic of 1918 1919, thereabouts, right? And we're seeing a resurgence of that, even though, we're talking after the pandemic here. I think it's because people have been sheltered quite a bit, though. Do you happen to have a copy of your book that you can show people?
Sure. Thank you so much. You'll recognize the image from the slideshow.
Yeah, so this book is available where anywhere books are sold, and Amazon and all that. They can just order that.
Yes, thank you so much. Yep, everywhere books are sold.
Good. And I noticed that there are other forms too, right? If people wanted to
There's
get
an audiobook. Yeah.
an audiobook too, huh? Yeah. Yeah. Well, good. Um, Before we get into the Q&A, I just want to remind anybody, if you have questions, go to the bottom there under reactions. There's you can click on that and you can raise your hand. But before I want to do that, I wanted to sort of say a couple of things. First off, if you enjoyed these types of webinars that we've been bringing you, we invite you to go to our website, ttahawaii.com. That's ttahawaii.com, and take a look. We are always open to donations and memberships too. We're also looking, we open our doors to everybody. There's no requirements or anything, as long as you want to help promote our Chinese culture. So with that, before we get into some of the questions, I did want to mention to you that we talked about stories, and I'm hoping some of the viewers would offer some of the stories, but I was going to just tell you really quickly. For me, when I was very young, I guess around 13 or something, I had my aunt and uncle. They asked me one time, he says, "Hey, do you want to join us for Mahjong?" And I said, "Oh yeah, of course. The adults are asking you to join." And my aunt and uncle were so good at this that I'm only building half of my wall and they're already throwing the card down to start play, So I had to learn how to catch up and do that. So that's how I learned. Edwina, would you mind sharing your story?
Okay. Well, I learned the Hong Kong way because I learned from my cousins who came originally from China, and then they went to Hong Kong, and they taught me. And I also learned when I was a teenager. So, and we would play just for fun, not so much for gambling, and then they taught me how to do points also. But I know that Mahjong has so many different variations. Even in Hawaii, there's games that they play where the point system is not always all the same either. And like you said, there's jokers. For the Hong Kong way, we have no jokers. All we play with flowers and the dragons. But I also know some people play with animals, which is something different also.
Interesting. Well, our club, we used to have Mahjong games, right? Our club is about 87 years old, thereabouts. And they used to play upstairs at our clubhouse. You would hear these clacking of tiles from the street, right? On Mauna Kea. Edwina?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's what I heard. Yeah. Well, I wasn't born either, but yeah. So tell us a little bit about this workshop that you're doing on Sunday. I know that it is full. You're still taking a waiting list, probably for another sessions or another couple sessions.
I have a second workshop on June 11. Right now, I already have 20 people that signed up for the second session already. So I'm thinking I might have to make a third one if I get more, because we only have 7 tables and 7 sets. So we only can put so many people in the clubhouse at one time.
Yeah. So if you folks want to sign up for that, you can get information by going again to our website. It has information on how to sign up for or put your name in on the waiting list to get a hold of Edwina there.
Yeah, I'd prefer if you can send me an email so that I have your email and I can communicate with you through email.
You want to just mention it? They now,
Oh.
and they can also go on the website too.
I can put my email in the chat. That'll be
Okay,
the easiest.
okay. So we have one more member I'd like to bring up, Val Wong. Val, I know that you didn't learn from your from when you were young. What was your experience anyway?
Well, what happened is I learned the fundamentals from my family. I'm a fourth generation Chinese, but my formalized experience with it was when I got married. And it was like almost like a prerequisite to joining the family. It seemed like actually it ended up being a generation connector and I guess an in-law connector as well, because they would be part of our Sunday night dinners. We would sort of have a potluck at my husband's parents' house, and we would play Mahjong, and grandmother and children would all be there, and we would have dinner, and then after dinner we would get together for Mahjong. And it was nice because I know grandma really looked forward to it, and it was a chance to play, you know, with the grandma and the different grandchildren and whatever. And even when she passed, you know, when we had our in-laws over for dinner, that was a normal thing. And it was very nice because you wouldn't have these periods of silence between your conversation. You'd be playing, and then in between you'd say, oh, by the way, have you heard of this restaurant? Or how is so-and-so been? And it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. So we've, our two daughters have also learned how to play Mahjong, and they've taught their spouses, and even one of my in-laws who's not Chinese has decided they want to learn how to play. So it's been a real social connector, and I really enjoy it. Thank you.
Good, good. Okay, so let's open it up for some questions. Edwina, you want to go ahead and call the first person?
I think Gail Levy has her hand up.
Gail, if you can unmute yourself and then go ahead and ask your question.
Can you hear me? I'm Gail Levy.
Yeah.
And I just brought down my Mahjong set that's been in my closet for like 40 years. And I found that I had this book, and I was just wondering, it's How to Play Pung Chao by L.L. Har, and was written in 1923. I don't know where I got this book, but it's been up there for 40 years now. And it mentioned, you know, one of the myths about it started during the court of King of Wu, known as Nampo, in 472 BC. And it was for the consort and court ladies, and it was restricted to the use of the emperors and their friends of the Mandarin class. And if anybody in the lower classes were caught playing this game, the penalty paid by one of the other classes paying P Ling at the time was a loss of his head.
Oh.
There were consequences. But anyway, I found this book. I don't know how I got it, but it was by L.L. Har, written in, as I said, you know, he says this is a myth, that it started, this is the story where it started and how old it was during the time of Confucius. So that.
Do you have a question for Dr. Heinz?
So, no, really, it's just whether she, you know, is familiar with this book and how it fits into the history of Mahjong.
Yes, show and tell. I love it. Thank you so much for bringing that. And yeah, L.L. Har and his Peng Chao was what he was in many ways Babcock's prime competitor. And remember that how I was saying he was there was like one marketer that was particularly really actually vicious towards contemporary Chinese Americans and Chinese people, in saying, you know, they play the degraded version, I make the authentic version in the United States. That's him. So he And part of why you see names like Peng Chao proliferate in this time, which of course, Peng and Chao, that's also referring to specific words that people were saying when they were playing the game. But he argued that Peng Chao was authentic and Mahjong was the degraded version, right? That sucker Babcock was selling. And so part of why that was happening was because early on, Babcock was really never the only person who was trying to import Mahjong, especially once it became clear that it was making huge amounts of money. But he was really trying hard to control the market, totally unsuccessfully. But he starts suing people left and right. He sues people in the United States. He sues people in Europe, saying you can't use the word Mahjong. And basically what happens is he never successfully wins one of those lawsuits, but he effectively stops people from using the exact same name. And so you start seeing this proliferation of like all kinds of different names to refer to it. And there was one ridiculous version that was being sold by the words like under the title Mahjong, which is nonsensical. But then underneath it said, pronounced Mahjong, right? But they're trying to say, we're not really infringing on copyright. We've got a different thing, even though really everyone is peddling the same thing with slightly different variations. So you get these huge marketing wars because thousands and thousands of dollars, right, are changing hands related to these games, and people are trying to corner the market.
Nice. Edwina, who do we have next?
I have Nadine Siak.
Nadine, can you unmute? Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
No, wonderful. I'm not really showing up against my basket. I apologize for my ghostly appearance at the moment. But I'm a Jewish New Yorker, formerly from New York, and I actually did not hear anything about Mahjong growing up. Wasn't until I lived in China and then married into a Chinese Malay family. So I was kind of curious. It wasn't just Jewish middle-class women who were having that leisure time themselves. I'm trying to think, what made it so attractive to Jewish middle-income women versus, is there any sort of reflection of Jewish culture in the fact that the Jewish women took so strongly to Mahjong?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the sets of questions. And just so I know, when were you growing up? Like what decades were you growing up and where?
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I grew up in the Bronx, born in 1964.
Okay.
My dad was a Brooklyn boy through and through. My mom was from Queens. My cousins lived on Long Island and Manhattan. We had all the boroughs but Staten Island.
Yep.
And I grew up there. So it was very New York Jewish.
Yes. It's interesting that Mahjong was not at all a part of your milieu, and somewhat surprising, but less surprising in the sense that that is kind of the tail end of the heyday of the intensity of Mahjong as a cultural marker. That's changing again. There's a resurgence among retiring baby boomers, but the next generation, the baby boomers themselves, did not pick up Mahjong to nearly the same extent as their mothers had, in part because of this cultural change and a generational, oftentimes intentional rejection of what their mothers had done, right? They didn't want to get married, have kids, and move to the suburbs. And Mahjong was such an important part and such embedded in that kind of post-war domesticity that oftentimes the next generation actually really consciously rejected it, though many are coming back to it later in life. And I think that the specific, there's no one single reason why this becomes an important part of Jewish American culture and women's culture. And part of it is simply like a historical accident in the sense of the League came together, right? The League existed, and they happened to be Jewish women. and it happened to be Mahjong. But one of the and I was really interested to know. I see this question from Evelyn. Great question in the comments. I really was interested to know: is there anything particular to the fact that, for example, the Lower East Side in New York is a place of overlapping cultural markers? There was a refugee Jewish population in Shanghai in the 1940s. Maybe that's where it came from. Maybe it was the fact that so many Jewish families went to Chinese restaurants on Sundays and on Christmas. Like,
We did that. We did that, yes.
Yeah, everybody did. So, I was like, is it one of those places? Is it one of those reasons? No, those were actually not. There is no evidence that any of those contexts were where this cultural transfer happened. It really was connected to this history in the United States that's rooted in the 1920s, and how that then is transformed in the context of the League. But again, still, why did that become such an important part of Jewish women's culture in particular? Part of that had to do with these specific and unique leisure contexts and communities that Jewish Americans built that had their roots earlier in the 20th century, because Jewish Americans were not able to access many other leisure resorts, including in the Catskills, that were run by and for white Christians. And so, right, there was there was a lot of segregation, anti-Semitic segregation, that was part of why there were Jewish-specific leisure spaces. But after World War II, there are a whole set of changes that happen that really create a kind of demographic shift for Jewish Americans that combine. And it's very important that in this moment, after World War II, because of the fight against the Nazis, anti-Semitism, explicit anti-Semitism, becomes far less culturally acceptable and legally acceptable in the United States. And because after World War II, the United States is trying to advertise itself to potential political allies around the world as a bulwark of freedom against communism, right? So they're really positioning themselves against the USSR and against China after 1949. And so and at the same time, the communist powers are saying, they're not a country of freedom. Yeah. Look at all this racism and the Black people being beaten in the street and gunned down with fire hoses, and they're using those images. So the government and media very intentionally try to shift American culture to become less explicitly racist, and part of that involves a both class and ethnic categorization shift experienced by a new group called white ethnics. So Jewish Americans and Italian Americans, who were previously really not considered white, were excluded from this kind of Protestant defined whiteness. These were Catholics and Christian Jews. And they are able to newly access things like higher education, apart from quotas, federally backed mortgages that allow them to buy homes in these suburban areas that Black Americans cannot, and that, depending on where you're looking at, Asian Americans cannot and Hispanic Americans cannot. But Italian Americans and Jewish Americans could for the first time. And also able to access new professional routes of upward mobility. So there's this kind of demographic shift that's not universal, but that many, many, many people, many Jewish Americans experience, of upward mobility into also white suburbia. And so you've got this, like, both the possibilities of that upward mobility and the promises of that, and the constraints and the problems, including the sense of, like, are we going to lose what makes us Jewish in a sense, if we're no longer Orthodox, we're moving into these suburbs and we're in the same schools. And so cultural markers become I'm not saying anyone was doing this intentionally, but effectively become one key strand that also marks space. And Chinese culture is not Christian predominantly. and also has all those associations that I talked about earlier of, quote, otherness. So Mahjong was both American and other. And there is this like kind of triangulation that I think happened on a subterranean cultural level that, again, when no one's consciously thinking about that or intentionally doing it, but I think that is part of how it becomes so important.
Thank you for that really wonderful answer. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Who's
I
next,
think
Edwina?
we have a question from Darnell DePaoli.
Hi. Hi. I'm interested to know if with the explosion in exports and the change in the production, the mass production of the tiles, and the piecemeal shipping out of cow shin bones from the Midwest, if China was able to do anything about the tariffs imposed on the import of the games. That's my question.
Yeah, good question. So really in this moment, the early 1920s, and certainly into the 1930s, China was in a profoundly weak position geopolitically. They were really, Shanghai itself was a semi-colonial treaty port city, meaning that all these foreign powers stemming from 70 years earlier, from the mid to late 1800s, had been carving up China's autonomy. This is part of the Opium Wars. This is part of, trying to force China to use the gold standard instead of the silver standard. And China's government, right, is under enormous pressure. It's crumbling. People are hungry. There's all this corruption in the court. And then in the 1920s, we have a successful Republican revolution, right, led in large part by Sun Yat-sen, supported by an overseas Chinese population. And so there's a huge amount of political tumult in China happening at this time, and then the warlord period takes over, right, where there's not really a strong centralized government, and the nationalists are fighting the communists, and there's intense kind of fracture. And in this period of the fad years, this is the nationalist period, and so there's a ton of reformers trying to figure out how to strengthen China's global position and government and its ability to create better conditions for itself and its people around the world, but it is not in any position to effectively do that. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. We have 3 more questions. How is your time, Dr. Heinz?
I'm happy to stay and talk a little more, but
okay.
also no pressure.
Okay. So after these 3 questions, if there are any other questions beyond that, just go ahead and send your questions over to her, or you could send it to us at Tsung Tsin, and we can get those answers for you. Okay, who's next, Edwina?
Helen Slaughter.
Hi, Helen.
I recently started playing Mahjong with a group of friends who are not Chinese, but they say that the kind of Mahjong they're playing is Chinese. So one of the things I'd like to know is how can I tell if it's Chinese or American, or is it a combination? So that's one question. But the other question is, since it is a fun game and I think good for your mind, I'd like to know what age child. I have some great-grandchildren who are part Chinese, and I wondered what age would be a good time to start teaching them how to play Mahjong, and what your advice is about that. My great-grandchildren are 4 and 6 right now. The 6-year-old is very bright, and so anyway, I'd like to know your advice on that.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I'm sure there are many folks in the audience who could speak to their experiences of learning and just growing up around it as children. But I think it's never too young to start familiarizing them with just even interacting with the tiles, as long as it's not a choking hazard anymore, where, even very young children can even just use the tiles as building blocks, but it gets them familiar with the designs. And once they start getting old enough to kind of sit, right, they can sit with you and help, they can help pass tiles even, right? And once they're around that, then you can start having them play. If you're playing the Chinese version, what's great is that you can play this very simplified version that doesn't involve scoring and really is a lot like Gin Rummy. And that is a very simple game. And it doesn't have all the strategy attached to it. They can learn that later. But I think that's, anyway, I'm sure other people have other suggestions. Feel free to put them in the chat if you have other suggestions for Helen, but that's certainly what I hear from people about their own experiences. And if folks are telling you that they're playing the Chinese version, then they probably are. As someone mentioned earlier, I think maybe it was Edwina mentioned, there are lots of variations, even within quote unquote Chinese Mahjong, right? But so depending on where they learned it, they may be having a very specific kind of regional variation. But if you're playing with some of those defining markers like the card, then you're playing the leagues version. If you're playing with capture tiles or animal tiles, then you're playing potentially Vietnamese or Singaporean Mahjong, right? There are specific characteristics that define different variations. But there, Chinese Mahjong, even with all those variations, those are more slight differences where you can learn and kind of transfer across those different styles, as opposed to really a significant step level difference between kind of country specific variations. But I think it's wonderful you're playing. And it is very good for everyone's mind.
Do you explain the differences in your book?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, in a, without getting too far in the weeds,
Right.
I think instructors and people like Edwina can tell you a lot more in terms of the nitty gritty. But I do, for like just understanding big picture, these are the things that characterize these different forms,
Right.
and this is how they're different. Yeah.
Helen, I would say to you, my answer is as soon as they stop putting it in their mouth, trying to eat it, that's when you can get them started. Okay, Edwina, who do we have next?
Cindy Yi.
Oh, hi. I'm from Los Angeles, and in the last decade, with the Chinese Historical Society of Los Angeles, as well as San Diego State University, we've been having Jewish people who've been coming to our organizations to speak about their time in Shanghai. And some Jewish people have written books, and one of them, her name is Esther Shippen, whose family actually lived in Shanghai for about 100 years, way before World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to probably contact her because she might have some information about, possibly of Mahjong coming, with the Jewish people, bringing it over to the United States. But we've had really good lectures among the Jewish people because Shanghai was a no visa port. And after they left, after the war ended, a lot of them left. And, it's a great game, so I think they did learn it in Shanghai and then brought it over. But
yeah, I should clarify that. Yes, there is a longer standing historical Jewish community and population, often also Sephardic Jewish population. So Persia, rather than Eastern Europe, that were there in the turn of the 20th century and the 1910s and 20s. And that was, they worked to support the population of European refugees who came as, yes, one of the few places that they could be offered a safe harbor during the Holocaust. And that was, so there is that kind of historical connection across a longer rooted community. And absolutely, Jewish Shanghai landers played Mahjong alongside all those other expats that I was talking about. Like absolutely, people were playing 1920s style Mahjong, and they taught the refugees potential. That was probably one of the kind of social connectors. There's a very good chance that they were playing Shanghai along with lots of other people in that specific context in Shanghai. That's different than the specific forms of Mahjong that emerge that we now associate specifically with Jewish American culture, that also then eventually spreads around the world and becomes part of Israeli culture and all this stuff. That is specifically coming out of the US-based context. But it's not that Jewish people weren't playing it in other, in the 1920s. Again, in the 1920s, pretty much everyone was playing it.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Edwina, our last question.
I think Gail already did hers. Gail Levy.
I just wanted to share. I just wanted to share two memories that I have of Mahjong. One is growing up in Khalid Palama during the 40s and 50s, where my parents and the neighborhood would start a game Friday night and it wouldn't end until Sunday afternoon. The game kept going, the clacking of the tiles. So I would go to sleep to the clacking of the tiles and get up to the clacking of the tiles, and people would take turns going to sleep and they would take turns eating and stuff like that. But the game started Friday night and lasted until Sunday afternoon. That's my earliest memory, and I'm maybe 6, 7, 8 years old. And then my next memory was when I met my in-laws. Okay, they lived in Boston, Jewish, Mattapan, Roxbury. That was a Jewish ghetto type thing. And my sister-in-law introduced me to her game of Mahjong with the tiles and all that kind of stuff like that. So it was really interesting that I said, this is Mahjong. This wasn't the Mahjong that I grew up with, but this was, the Jewish American Mahjong with the winning hands every year. So it was two completely different situations.
Yes, that's great. And who did you say, so those like multi-day games that would just keep going and going, did you say that was like family members or friends? Or
well, it was the neighborhood. We had a very tight neighborhood. So all the people in the neighborhood, so they were like about maybe 12, 13 people, but they would be rotating through the game.
And what did the kids do during that time?
Well, we would be playing, we'd be sitting, we'd be eating, we'd be sleeping. I mean, we would do but it wasn't like it was a child-centered society. I mean, the adults did what they did and the kids just sort of did what they did kind of thing. So it was like, but going to sleep. And then I would go down to Ala Park, visit relatives when there were houses at Ala Park, and I would be walking down the streets with the pool halls and the clacking of the tiles. And these are big games. I mean, thousands of dollars, huge game. So that was my memory.
Oh, I'm so glad you shared that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this. This is so wonderful. Just a couple of announcements. Our club is going to be doing another webinar in May, around the 27th, I believe. One of our members is Lynette Low Tom. She used to be with the Honolulu Advertiser as a writer, and she's written a couple of Chinese cookbooks, including dim sum in Hawaii. We're going to have her talk. I'm not sure exactly what we're going to be discussing, but it's definitely going to be about food, which everybody loves. And so I hope you can make that. I'm going to send a notice out to everybody who registered on this if you want to go ahead and join us for that. I do want to remind you, if you enjoy these things, please support us either through a donation or you can join. Just go to our website, ttahawaii.com. And of course, lastly, Dr. Heinz's book, Mahjong. I strongly recommend that you folks find it either at one of the local bookstores or order it online. I guess, Dr. Heinz, maybe you can sort of give a quick idea of the book. What's the book about?
Well, you just got a sneak peek today. That was the
Okay.
big picture, but I go into a lot more stories, talk a lot. I have a whole section thinking if you're interested specifically in Chinese American history, a section about Mahjong at the Angel Island Immigration Detention Center as experienced by Chinese migrants that I didn't get to talk about today. So there's so much more, but yeah, thank you.
Great. And your email address? Well,
Yes,
what is that?
I'll
again?
type it in here. It's heinzam@uoregon.edu.
Okay. All right. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Like I said, any kind of questions, just come to our website. You can email me and put an email in there, and we can send a message to Dr. Heinz, or, you know, if you want to join us on our next event or join us for membership. We'd love to have you. Okay. Well, thank you, Edwina. Thank you, Val. Thank you. And definitely, Dr. Heinz, thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thank you. It was really my pleasure.
Okay. See you, folks.
Bye.
Aloha.